Seems the days are getting longer. So many people are confused. The when and where are up grass, depending on your choice of news. But please tell me, where do we go from here? Don't forget me. That's what they whisper in my ear. The ones who have fought so hard to be here at the table of freedom. Us fills a space representing the human race. Every one of us has a voice. Each and every day we make a choice, whether to be the good we all want to see in this world, whether or not to be the change that we all know we should be, for the sake of the ones who are gathered around the table of freedom. Oh, it will never be easy. It will take a lot of courage and strength. But keep your heart open and never let it close, my friend. The door must stay open so everyone here can see the table of freedom. We will be the change we all want to see in this world, and we will be the change that we all know we should be, for the sake of the ones who faithfully come to the table of freedom.
Greetings again, friends, and welcome to another edition of Midweek Moments with St. John's. These moments are brought to you by St. John's Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. My name is Dennis Faust, and I have the blessing and the privilege of serving the people of St. John's as their senior minister. These times that we spend each week are varied in length. Today's is possibly the most lengthy that I have offered to you. It's probably because I'm missing the pulpit and I'm missing us gathering as a congregation. But today, what I want to say to you is important for several reasons. First, I want to say a word of affirmation to our graduates. Second, I want to tell you about an exciting event that happened in the life of the church this past week that will affect our ministry together for several years ahead. And I also want to say some words about what's important to me and on my heart about what all is going on in our nation in terms of all of the violence, the mean-spiritedness that's happening right now, and how we might feel a little bit anxious and want to make a difference. So those are the topics we're going to cover today. The first word that I want to say is To these graduates, I'm going to say a word to the graduates, and most likely none of these 17 high school graduates are listening in the midweek moments. This is more for adults. But if any of your parents or grandparents are listening in, just know that we are proud of you, and we're going to continue to pray with you and pray for you, and be there to guide you along in your faith journey in the years ahead. The other thing that I wanted to say is to make sure you know this Sunday we will recognize all 17 of our high school graduates this year. We will recognize them during worship on Sunday morning. Lee Gray will bring the message. It's a message entitled The Teacher. And Lee will be helping us understand what he has learned from his sister Beth, who lives with blindness and also with some mental handicaps, and he has learned a great deal from her, and we're going to learn through his learning this next Sunday morning. I look forward to this message and sharing it with you. I am appreciative of Lee and his 23 faithful years as our minister with youth and young adults. Last Sunday, the church called Reverend Nate Dove to be our new minister with youth and young adults, as Lee transitions to be our first minister for congregational care. All of this will take place in July. Nate and his wife Emma will move into Charlotte in July from Virginia, and we look forward to them joining us in ministry. Nate is a very bright young minister, and he will join an outstanding church staff, and we have many good years ahead of us as we try to make an impact here in Charlotte and beyond. The other word that I want to say to you this week is about voices and choices. Voices and choices are building blocks for how we build healthy relationships and how we get along with one another in our communities. During this episode, I'm going to refer a few times to the elevated spirit of rancor, the division, the violence rampant in our nation right now. But it's going to take more than words, friends, and it's going to take more than protest and even more than legislation for us to move beyond centuries of lies and deception and evil that have brought us to moments like these. The injustices that feed today's violence can only be changed by human lives listening to the voice of God within us and making choices to live together in God's ways. Now, we cannot fix all these problems, but we can do what we can do. We can tune our spirits to the Spirit of Jesus Christ, and we can do what we can do. So, beloved, alongside you, with my only one voice, I'm going to listen for God's voice in my spirit. And I'm going to pray for my voice to reflect God's voice. Like you, sometimes I listen and I obey God's voice better than I do at other times. But our concomitant voices and our concomitant choices can create a better world. Alongside you, my prayerful desire is to make choices based on the voice of God and other voices that I think, I believe, I interpret to also represent God's voice most closely, especially more closely than others. I choose to use my voice to represent the ways of God in my relationships, and I do not apologize for being a follower of the way of Jesus as I do so. So here are two practices that are helpful to me as I strive to build a better world. And I encourage you, if these are helpful, for you to use these practices as well. The first practice is summed up in a phrase that's very familiar to all of us. It's not a biblical phrase, but I think it is a godly phrase. The catchphrase is this: think globally, act locally. Jesus was practical, direct, relational, and very local. Love one another, he said. Love your neighbor. Love your enemies. So who is your enemy? I do not know, but I know that you know. So let's be honest. There are some people that it is more difficult to build a relationship with these people than it is with other people. And so our tendency is to just have relationships with people like us. As God's people, we need to do better than this. We reach out across lines ecumenically and religiously, and we need to reach out across lines in all kinds of other ways as well, people who are different from us. We can only make the world better and healthier if we focus on the community where we live. So let's introduce ourselves, or let's take a step toward building healthier relationships by people that we already know. We differ from them in our theological perspectives or in our political ideas. Let's figure out how to stop trying to get everyone to agree with us, and let's understand one another and identify what it is we agree on and agree about, and let's major on those and quit trying to make our faith journey our political journey, and stop trying to make our political journey or our social issues journey our faith journey. Now, unless you've just crawled out from under a rock or awakened from a long coma, you know there are many voices competing for your attention right now. Some are bags of wind, some are making you quake, some are aflame with anger. Some shed tears. Some have been crying out for and investing their lives in peace building and understanding for decades. Some are new to this effort. Some are tired. Some are ignorant. Some are inflammatory. Some of these voices are just looking for something to do because they're bored. Some of these voices are Republican. Some of these voices are Democrat. Some of these voices are independent. Some of these voices are libertarian. Some are evil. Some are righteous. Some are fed up. Some are bitter. Some are violent. Some are malicious. Some are manipulative. Some are afraid. And these are only some of the voices asking you to make choices on their behalf. Well, beloved, you have committed your life to the way of Jesus. You've chosen the way of Jesus. So his voice in your life becomes the guiding voice for your choices. Jesus was divisive. Jesus was killed because he was divisive. There is a sick theology that's been taught for centuries. It suggests that Jesus died because God had to be appeased. The substitutionary atonement, they call it, it's balderdash. Anyone who connects the dots saying that a loving God had to be appeased for the sin of the world by the death of one, well, they've moved beyond theological calisthenics or gymnastics, and they're practicing theological contortionism. Jesus revealed the living God to be compassionate, gracious, merciful, and kind. This God did not need to be appeased. However, the Jesus who taught reconciliation, forgiveness, purity in spirit, inclusiveness, meekness, and servant leadership, this Jesus was divisive. He did not intend to be divisive, but his message is divisive. What was it about Jesus that was so divisive? Why did Jesus' message threaten political systems and religious power structures? Why did people refuse to listen to Jesus? Why did they kill him? He was not teaching anything that was odd. He was not teaching anything these people had not already heard. When Jesus taught them, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, he was pulling straight out of the Jewish law code. This was familiar information to his hearers. Jesus taught people love one another, and they killed him. How did this happen? This happened for the same reason that a person refuses your love. Have you ever tried to love a person and they refused you? Now, rejection of romantic love may be difficult for you, but there is worse pain. a person that you already love and that they love you, but you are loving them more than they are loving themselves, and you see them hurting themselves, or you see them drifting in a direction that is self-destructive, and you reach out in love to them, and they reject you. It hurts. Suffering can accompany love. When you love someone, you become vulnerable, even to the point where you risk being rejected. Love, you see, must be chosen. Jesus was killed by people who refused to choose the love of God. They chose and they valued power and privilege over love. Jesus was killed by people who chose injustice, self-centeredness, mean-spiritedness, bullying, and a misuse of power. Jesus was killed by people who do not choose the common good taught by God's ways. So they are constantly protecting the power they have amassed for themselves, or they have manipulated by controlling others, or they have been given this power by others as a privilege which they are supposed to share. Jesus' message has always been divisive. It's what got him killed, as I said. Jesus did not have to die. Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane was an honest inquiry, a sincere search for another way to accomplish God's redeeming love in the world. Jesus died because the religious power structures, aided and abetted by political structures, put their boot on Jesus' neck until he could no longer breathe. The manipulated crowd abdicated their responsibility to challenge the power structures. Jesus died because he chose to incarnate God's love, even if that meant people embraced darkness and the powers of darkness more than they embraced the power of God's love. Even though they insulted him, ridiculed him, beat him, spat upon him, put nails through his body, pierced his side with a spear, and left him to die. But it was true then, and it is true now. There is no other way to reveal the loving God in the world than to choose the ways of God. We must listen to God's voice, and we must make our choice to continue to invest our lives in the ways of God. Jesus was killed by people who rejected the embracing love of God. Jesus was divisive. Jesus is divisive. Beloved, today it seems to me as though I see a lot of people fighting against what we need most. We are caught up in political conflicts, cultural hatreds, racial prejudice, economic injustice, theological animosity, and religious isolationism. What we need most is the voice of Jesus guiding us. What we need most are choices given by God's ways. These challenging times remind us that we're all in this together. We cannot separate our commitment to follow the ways of God revealed in Jesus from the ways of justice, peace building, righteousness, and humility, for these ways are all the same way. In the winter of 1623, the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London was seriously ill. He wrote Meditation 17. And in that meditation are these words: "No man is an island entirely of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." Those few words have made John Donne's name memorable. The Apostle Paul said it this way: "Now you are the body of Christ, and individually members of it." The way of Jesus calls us to a life that, while it is deeply personal, it is never individualistic. Our life in the way of Jesus calls us into community. I like the way the activist priest Daniel Berrigan said it. We will walk in the kingdom of God together, or we won't walk in it at all. One practice to help you build a better world by building better relationships is to listen to the voice of God. Listen to the voice of God which Jesus listened to, and make choices that guide you in the ways of God's love. For Jesus told you, basically, to think globally and act locally. That's what he was saying when he said, love one another, love your neighbor, love your enemies. Now, a second practice that I use to help build a better world is a phrase, punch holes in darkness every day. When I was a young minister, I became tremendously discouraged. I had committed my life to be a congregational minister as a young man, in my late teens, actually. My father had always told me during my teen years, as I talked with him about potentially becoming a pastor, he would say, Dennis, if there's anything else you can do besides being a pastor, please do that. If you can be fulfilled doing anything else. That was because possibly my father was a pastor, and I had watched him. I had admired him, and I had admired how his life made a difference as he was there for people in crisis times, and as he was there to try to guide people and make himself available as a resource for people along the faith journey. I always appreciated the fact that Dad integrated a church racially in the 1960s in the midst of the tremendous challenge and conflict. I always respected him because as some people refused to talk to him and some people left the church, there were others who embraced that idea and how the African American community appreciated his inclusion. I tried. I tried to find fulfillment in anything else, but I couldn't do it. I even went to college and worked at Hallmark Cards and was pursuing a degree, and they were paying for my college expenses, my tuition, for me to have a degree in human resource development. And had a career path all mapped out, but I could not stay in that lane. I could not get away from this God's voice in my life. And so after months of trying to silence that voice, I made the choice to commit my life to serve God by serving people through the local church. I've been doing that now for 45 years. This calling has become clarified for me. It has never left me. The calling that clarified was that my primary role is to be an equipper of the saints for the work of ministry. This calling continues to be fulfilling for me. But when I was 22, in my first pastorate, my college pastorate, the challenge seemed too large for me. I had figured out that most of what I did didn't make much difference in people's lives. The needs of people and the needs of the world were huge, and I was only me. I was only one. I could do what I could do, but I saw so many more needs than I could address. I had a conversation with a wise minister, a friend of my father's. He had served as a faithful pastor for decades. I explained to him my sense of helplessness. I told him that I was afraid of losing my way. He told me the story of the lamplighter, which some of you probably know. Before electrical lights, lamplighters were the ones who walked the streets at dusk, and they would light the wicks in the lamps along the sidewalk. The lamplighters were essential workers in that time. One story is told of a child who was visiting from a rural area in a city and looked out an upstairs window just about the time that the lamplighter started his work in the evening. The child watched as the lamplighter in the darkness was going from pole to pole. After watching the lamplighter for a while with excitement, The child turned, ran toward the hallway, and said, "Mother, Mother, come see. A man is punching holes in the darkness." My older, wise friend then told me several stories of his ministry. And he said, "Dennis, I want to challenge you that every day you'll just do something to punch a hole in the darkness." Beloved, trust me, I know you can feel overwhelmed by today's darkness. I do not need to go through a long list of all of the stories you can see on the news or you can Google. But I do want to remind you that along with all of these stories, there are other stories as well. So while you are aware of the mounting death tolls of COVID-19, you're also aware there are people in laboratories giving 24-hour work in shifts, searching for a vaccine. And there are people recovering now, and there are people caring for the patients in their suffering. You're seeing light emerge from the darkness. You're seeing people punch holes in the darkness. Yes, we are grieving and we are angry over the unnecessary, the violent deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, and the hundreds, the thousands of others who over time have suffered because of the victimization and the brutality of white supremacy and people who are morally corrupt. There are stories all around that we could discuss and become overwhelmed by them. But I must remind you, there are also stories, not just stories of people who are protesting or people who are going way out of bounds with violence because they don't know how else to have their voice heard. There is a group of people working every day, has been working, will continue to work. You're seeing police chiefs embrace and dance with protesters. You're seeing officers take a knee beside protesters because they agree with their message. You're hearing officers step forward and say that we will call out any of our colleagues, and we ask our colleagues to call us out if we step out of bounds in enforcing the law. There are ways in which you and I, every day, are punching holes in darkness. The issues that are here are not what they used to be, and they're not what they're going to be. But we will continue to labor against those who continue to push darkness, those who refuse the love of God, those who push an agenda that is diametrically opposed to the love of God that is compassion, that creates space in our lives for one another. You are seeing people every day inspire you, and you are punching holes in darkness, housing the homeless, feeding the hungry, supporting the education of young children, in so many other ways, encouraging a friend, trying to help people move forward, punching holes in darkness, thinking globally, acting locally. Yes, there is still hatred, abuse, injustice everywhere. We've not made all the progress we wanted to make. We've not made all the progress we will make. We have made progress, though. We should not pat ourselves on the head and say, "Well done, that's enough." We're not the kind of people to do that anyway. We know we have not done enough. So we will continue to do more. And some of what we have done, we've done wrong, or we've done the wrong thing. And when we've learned that, we've tried to learn from it and move forward. So we keep punching holes in darkness. We follow Abraham Lincoln, who described himself by saying, "I am a slow walker, but I never walk backwards." Some of you are familiar with Rabbi Edwin Friedman, and his work in family systems theory. He popularized the phrase non-anxious presence. You know, it's not easy to be a non-anxious presence when you are feeling anxious yourself. But Friedman taught this idea, and I find it to be true in my life. It's one of the ways I've learned that people affirm in me that I'm punching holes in darkness. What Friedman teaches is if you can manage to regulate your anxiety enough, even if you're anxious, if you can regulate your anxiety enough to keep the outward expression of your anxiety just a notch or two below that of the group that you're in, then you're helping to bring the collective anxiety down. One of the roles we can have as St. John's is to be a non-anxious presence in the community, punching holes in the darkness, realizing that we are acting locally, but thinking how that impacts the world, while being a non-anxious presence, not overreacting or becoming overactive in ways that contribute to the problem. During these days alongside you, I'm asking many questions. I'm punching holes in the darkness while asking, am I taking Jesus seriously in my life? What if we all take Jesus seriously? What happens then? What does that look like? What if each person who claims the name of Jesus actually lives like Jesus? What if people who hold up the Bible uphold the Bible's teachings? What would that look like? I'm asking questions like, what if we make God's ways our ways? What happens then? Alongside you, I'm dealing with all of this frustration, this isolation of these days. We are missing communal dimensions of our lives. Virtual reality is not reality. Zoom rooms are not real rooms. And alongside you, I am concerned about what I see happening. I have a deep appreciation for law enforcement and very deep respect for law enforcement officers. But just like clergy and every other employment sector, there's some bad apples in the barrel and they need to be picked out. Recently, I happened upon a prayer. It's a prayer that was put on social media by the Director of Public Health in Arlington County, Virginia. His name is Dr. Ruben Varghese. Here's his prayer. Oh God, keep my anger from becoming meanness. Keep my sorrow from collapsing into self-pity. Keep my heart soft, soft enough to keep breaking. Keep my anger turned toward justice, not cruelty. Remind me that all of this, every bit of what I do, is for love. And keep me fiercely kind. Amen. Beloved, in the years ahead, we will do more than tell succeeding generations that we got through the pandemic and these other challenges. We will tell them how we got through them. We will tell them how we listened to God's voice and the other voices that we sense closely follow God's ways. We will tell them how we made choices to deepen our understanding of love and broaden our understanding of the pain and suffering of others. We will tell them how we loved and how we cared. We will tell them how our hearts broke open. We will tell them how we invested our energies and our resources to bring about the change that we could. We will explain to them how we kept our anger from becoming meanness, how we kept our hearts soft enough to keep breaking, how we kept our anger turned toward justice, not cruelty, how we acted in love. And we will tell them how God kept us, helped us stay fiercely kind. In 1968, in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., Martin Luther King gave a sermon, a speech. In that word, he had this phrase that you've heard many times: "We shall overcome, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Beloved, this arc does not bend by itself, and we do not bend this arc by ourselves. The power of God's compassionate love works within us and through us to bend the arc of the moral universe. We must listen to God's voice, the same voice Jesus listened to in his life. And we must make the choices that God's voice calls us to make, the choices of God's way of living. We do so every time we love one another, love our neighbor, or love our enemy. These efforts of acting locally have a cumulative impact, bending the arc toward justice around the globe and punching holes in darkness. You may know that Martin Luther King was not the originator of this idea about the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. He was quoting a minister who preached a sermon in 1853, the Reverend Theodore Parker, an abolitionist from Massachusetts. In his sermon, he wrote and read these words in 1853: "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight, but I can divine it by the conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." Beloved, I miss seeing you. I miss our ability to gather as a congregation during these months. And as I said earlier, the length of this week's midweek moments probably suggests that I'm also missing the St. John's pulpit as well. But I am alongside you. And individually and collectively, we are doing what we can do. We're thinking globally and acting locally, and we're punching holes in darkness. Do not grow weary in your efforts. We are serving a God of hope. For even after they killed the divisive Jesus, thinking they had triumphed and crushed his message, God brought Jesus back to life among his followers and empowers this message forevermore, even in us and beyond us, to those who come behind us. So we continue. We continue to think globally, act locally. We continue to punch holes in darkness. Amen and amen. May it be so among us. Shalom.